The sleek black Bentley pulled up to the modest Providence courthouse, its chrome gleaming against the weathered brick facade. Alexander Stone stepped out, adjusting his $3,000 Armani suit with the practiced arrogance of a man who'd never lost a case that mattered. His Rolex caught the morning light as he surveyed the building with barely concealed disdain. This was supposed to be a simple traffic violation hearing, a waste of his 800-per-hour expertise. The brass nameplate on his briefcase read Stone and Associates, but everyone knew Alexander Stone was a one-man empire. His reputation for crushing opponents in corporate litigation had made him wealthy beyond measure. 20 years of high-stakes legal battles had hardened him into something resembling a human iceberg. Stone's polished Oxford shoes clicked against the courthouse steps like a countdown to confrontation. He'd heard about this Judge Caprio, some local celebrity who supposedly ran his courtroom like a neighborhood counseling session. The very thought made Stone's jaw tighten with professional disgust. Real justice, he believed, was about precedent, procedure, and power, not feel-good theatrics for the cameras. His client, a wealthy real estate developer, had received multiple citations for blocking fire lanes during construction. Stone's plan was simple: overwhelm the small-town judge with legal technicalities and walk away with a dismissal. He'd done it countless times before in far more prestigious courts than this cramped municipal building. The courthouse lobby buzzed with ordinary people clutching crumpled papers and worried expressions. Stone observed them like a predator studying prey. Single mothers, elderly immigrants, working-class families who couldn't afford lawyers like him. These were the people who typically folded under pressure, who accepted plea deals and paid fines they couldn't afford. Today would be different, though. Today, someone with real legal firepower was walking into Judge Caprio's domain. Stone straightened his platinum cufflinks and checked his phone one last time. His assistant had briefed him on the judge's background. Former defense attorney, known for unconventional sentences, beloved by locals for his supposed compassion. Compassion! Stone muttered under his breath as he approached the courtroom doors. In his world, compassion was weakness, empathy was exploitation, and sentiment was the enemy of success. He'd built his fortune on the principle that justice belonged to whoever could afford the best representation. Judge Frank Caprio was about to learn what happened when small-town idealism met big-city legal warfare. Stone pushed open the courtroom doors with the confidence of a man who'd never been outmatched. The wooden benches, the modest American flag, the simple dignity of the space. It all seemed quaint and provincial to his metropolitan sensibilities. Within minutes, he would discover that true wisdom often wears the most humble disguise. Judge Frank Caprio looked up from his papers as Alexander Stone strode into the courtroom with theatrical confidence. The contrast was immediate and striking. Stone's designer suit against the judge's simple black robe, arrogance meeting humility. "Your Honor," Stone announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to commanding million-dollar boardrooms. He didn't wait for permission to approach the bench, already pulling legal documents from his leather briefcase. The judge's eyes, weathered by decades of seeing humanity at its most vulnerable, took in every detail of this newcomer. Stone's expensive cologne seemed to clash with the honest atmosphere of the modest courtroom. Something in the lawyer's demeanor immediately told Judge Caprio that this wouldn't be an ordinary hearing. "Mr. Stone, I presume," Judge Caprio said with characteristic warmth, gesturing toward the defendant's table. His voice carried no hostility, only the patient tone of someone who'd dealt with difficult personalities before. Stone remained standing, interpreting the judge's politeness as weakness rather than strength. "Your Honor, I'm here regarding the citations issued to my client, Morrison Development Corporation," he began formally. The lawyer's tone suggested he was already bored by the proceedings, checking his Rolex as if timing how quickly he could dispose of this minor inconvenience. Judge Caprio noticed the gesture but said nothing, his expression remaining neutral and attentive. The courtroom fell silent except for the gentle hum of the old air-conditioning system. Stone launched into his opening strategy with the precision of a surgeon wielding a scalpel. "I've reviewed the citations in question, and I believe we'll find significant procedural irregularities that render them invalid," he stated coolly. His briefcase snapped open like a trap, revealing meticulously organized legal documents and case law precedents. The lawyer's confidence filled the room like expensive perfume, overwhelming in its intensity and artificial in its sweetness. Judge Caprio listened without interruption, his hands folded calmly on the bench before him. Stone continued his presentation, citing municipal code violations and jurisdictional technicalities with mechanical efficiency. Each legal argument was delivered like a chess move, calculated to intimidate and overwhelm. "Furthermore, Your Honor," Stone pressed on, "I question whether this court has been applying consistent standards of justice." The words hung in the air like an unspoken challenge, their implication clear to everyone present. Stone's eyes gleamed with the anticipation of intellectual combat, expecting the judge to either capitulate or engage in legal warfare. Judge Caprio's expression remained unchanged, but something shifted in the atmosphere of the courtroom, a subtle tension that suggested this confrontation was far from over. The other defendants waiting their turn sensed the brewing storm between these two very different approaches to justice. Stone smiled slightly, mistaking the judge's silence for surrender rather than the calm before a masterful response. The stage was set for a collision between cynicism and compassion that would change everything. Stone's confidence reached its peak as he prepared to deliver what he considered his knockout blow. "Your Honor, with all due respect, I've observed your unconventional approach to judicial proceedings," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. The pause before unconventional was deliberate, designed to suggest that Judge Caprio's methods were unprofessional or worse. Stone gestured dismissively toward the courtroom's simple furnishings, as if the modest setting validated his superior legal philosophy. "In my 20 years of practice in federal and Supreme Courts, I've never witnessed such casual disregard for legal precedent." His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to intimidating opponents into submission. The lawyer's eyes gleamed with the predatory satisfaction of a hunter closing in on wounded prey. "You seem to prioritize emotional theatrics over actual jurisprudence," Stone continued, his words cutting through the courtroom's respectful silence. Judge Caprio's expression remained perfectly calm, but the other defendants shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Stone interpreted their discomfort as validation of his assessment rather than disapproval of his arrogance. "Justice, Your Honor, is about consistency, precedent, and the impartial application of law, not feel-good stories for social media." His briefcase clicked shut with finality, punctuating his criticism like an exclamation point. The lawyer straightened his platinum tie clip, a gesture that seemed to emphasize the vast difference between his world and this humble courtroom. Stone's smile was razor-sharp, confident that he'd just exposed what he saw as judicial weakness. "I challenge the very foundation of how you conduct these proceedings," Stone declared, his voice rising slightly with theatrical emphasis. The words "challenge" hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown down before medieval combat. Several spectators in the gallery exchanged glances, sensing that something significant was happening beyond a simple traffic violation hearing. Stone's posture was that of a gladiator in an expensive suit, ready for intellectual combat. "My client deserves justice based on legal merit, not whatever mood strikes the bench today," he added with calculated insult. The lawyer's breathing was slightly elevated, energized by his own boldness in confronting what he perceived as small-town judicial incompetence. Judge Caprio's silence stretched on, creating a tension that filled every corner of the modest courtroom. "So I ask you directly, Your Honor," Stone said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that somehow commanded more attention than shouting. "Will you apply actual legal standards to this case, or shall we continue this charade of community theater?" The insult was delivered with surgical precision, designed to provoke either capitulation or an emotional outburst. Stone's expensive pen clicked rhythmically against his legal pad, marking time like a metronome of arrogance. The courtroom held its collective breath, waiting for Judge Caprio's response to this unprecedented challenge. Stone's eyes never left the judge's face, searching for any sign of the anger or defensiveness he expected to provoke. The lawyer's smile widened slightly, convinced that he'd just checkmated a small-town amateur in the game of legal chess. What he didn't anticipate was that he was about to discover the difference between intelligence and wisdom. Maria Santos clutched her crumpled citation with trembling hands as she approached the bench, her worn sneakers squeaking against the polished floor. The single mother of three had been working double shifts at the hospital cafeteria, trying to make ends meet after her husband's death. Her ancient Honda Civic had been ticketed for parking in a loading zone during her brief stop at the pharmacy to pick up her daughter's asthma medication. The $75 fine might as well have been $750 for someone living paycheck to paycheck, choosing between groceries and utilities each month. Stone watched her approach with the clinical detachment of someone studying an insect under a microscope, already calculating how to use her case to prove his point. Judge Caprio's expression softened immediately, recognizing the familiar weight of genuine hardship in her hesitant steps. This was exactly the type of case that Stone believed demonstrated the judge's bleeding heart weakness. "Mrs. Santos," Judge Caprio said gently, his voice carrying the warmth of a grandfather addressing a beloved family member. The woman's eyes filled with tears at the simple kindness in his tone, so different from the bureaucratic coldness she'd expected. "Please tell me what happened that day," the judge continued, leaning forward slightly to show he was genuinely listening. Stone rolled his eyes theatrically, making sure the judge noticed his disdain for what he considered irrelevant emotional manipulation. Maria's story spilled out in broken English mixed with Spanish, her voice cracking as she described rushing between jobs to care for her sick child. The courtroom fell silent as her genuine struggle filled the space, her honesty more compelling than any legal argument. Stone checked his watch again, his impatience growing with each word of what he considered a sob story. "Your Honor, while I sympathize with Mrs. Santos's situation, the law doesn't provide exceptions for personal circumstances," Stone interrupted, his voice cutting through Maria's testimony like a blade. The woman flinched at his harsh tone, instinctively stepping back as if physically struck by his coldness. Judge Caprio raised his hand gently, signaling for Stone to wait while Maria finished her explanation. "The citation was issued properly, the violation is clear, and precedent demands consistent enforcement regardless of individual hardship," Stone continued relentlessly. His legal training had taught him to view cases as puzzles to be solved, not human dramas requiring compassion. Maria looked between the two men, sensing that her fate hung in the balance of their philosophical conflict. Stone's smile was predatory, confident that he'd just trapped the judge between law and sentiment. Furthermore, Stone pressed his advantage. Allowing emotional appeals to override legal standards sets a dangerous precedent that undermines the entire judicial system. His words were delivered with the precision of a surgeon making an incision, designed to expose what he saw as Judge Caprio's fundamental weakness. Maria's shoulders sagged under the weight of his legal logic, her hope beginning to crumble like her crumpled citation. The courtroom atmosphere grew heavy with tension as two completely different approaches to justice faced off over this woman's simple human struggle. Stone gestured toward Maria, as if she were evidence in his case against the judge's methods, reducing her to a prop in his intellectual argument. Judge Caprio's eyes never left Maria's face, seeing in her the dignity of every person who'd ever stood before his bench, seeking not just legal resolution, but human understanding. The stage was set for a response that would reveal whether justice was truly blind or whether it could see with the eyes of compassion. Alexander Stone hadn't always been the cold, calculating machine that now dominated corporate boardrooms across the Northeast. 25 years earlier, he'd been Alex Stonkowski, a scrappy kid from Providence's Federal Hill neighborhood whose immigrant father worked 3 jobs to keep food on the table. His mother had stood in courtrooms just like this one, clutching traffic citations and utility shut-off notices with the same desperate hope he now saw in Maria Santos's eyes. Young Alex had watched his parents navigate a legal system that seemed designed to crush people who couldn't afford proper representation. The memory of his mother's tears after losing their small grocery store to a predatory landlord had carved something cold and hard into his developing psyche. Those early experiences had taught him that the law was a weapon, and he'd spent decades learning to wield it with ruthless precision. The transformation from Alex to Alexander had been deliberate and methodical, each success building another layer of armor around his vulnerable core. Harvard Law School had polished away his working-class accent and taught him that sentiment was the enemy of success. His first major victory had come defending a corporation against a class-action lawsuit filed by families whose children had been poisoned by contaminated water. The $50 million settlement he'd helped minimize could have provided real justice for those families. But Stone had learned to measure victory in billable hours, not human welfare. Each subsequent case had moved him further from his roots, trading pieces of his soul for partnership tracks and corner offices. The expensive suits and luxury cars weren't just status symbols. They were fortifications against ever feeling powerless again. Stone had convinced himself that his success validated his philosophy. Compassion was weakness, and only the strong survived. But standing in Judge Caprio's courtroom, watching Maria Santos struggle with the same helplessness his mother had faced, cracks began appearing in Stone's carefully constructed emotional armor. The woman's broken English reminded him of his grandmother's voice, her calloused hands, of his father's endless labor, her desperate dignity of everything his family had fought to maintain. For a moment, the expensive cologne couldn't mask the scent of his mother's pierogi kitchen, and the Italian leather shoes felt like the second-hand sneakers he'd worn to school. Stone's jaw tightened as he fought against the unwelcome surge of memory and emotion threatening his professional composure. He'd spent decades running from that scared little boy who'd watched his parents suffer. But the courtroom's humble atmosphere was dragging him back to those painful origins. The realization hit Stone like a physical blow. He'd become everything he'd once despised about the legal system that had failed his family. His success had been built on perfecting the very coldness and indifference that had crushed his parents' dreams decades earlier. The corporate clients he represented were the same type of powerful entities that had steamrolled over immigrant families like his own. Stone's hands trembled slightly as he gripped his briefcase, the weight of this revelation threatening to topple the carefully constructed identity he'd spent his adult life building. Judge Caprio's patient attention to Maria Santos wasn't weakness. It was the kind of justice Stone's family had needed but never received. The lawyer's breathing became shallow as he struggled to maintain his professional facade while confronting the uncomfortable truth about who he'd become. In challenging Judge Caprio's compassion, Stone had unknowingly challenged the memory of his own abandoned humanity. Judge Caprio looked directly at Alexander Stone, his weathered eyes reflecting decades of wisdom earned through countless encounters with human nature. "Mr. Stone," he began, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had nothing to prove and everything to give. The judge's tone held no anger or defensiveness, only the patient strength of a man secure in his principles and purpose. I've been listening very carefully to your concerns about my methods, and I want you to know that I take them seriously. His words surprised Stone, who had expected either capitulation or confrontation, not this measured thoughtfulness. The courtroom fell into respectful silence as Judge Caprio prepared to address the challenge that had been thrown down before him. Stone's confidence wavered slightly in the face of such unexpected composure and dignity. You speak of precedent and consistency, and these are indeed important pillars of our legal system, Judge Caprio continued, his hands folded calmly before him. But let me share something with you that 25 years on this bench has taught me about real justice. The judge's voice carried the weight of experience, each word chosen with the precision of someone who understood their power. The law is not a mathematical equation where human suffering gets cancelled out by legal technicalities. Stone found himself leaning forward despite his attempt to maintain professional distance, drawn in by the judge's unexpected eloquence. Judge Caprio's eyes never left Stone's face, as if he could see through the expensive suit to something deeper beneath. The lawyer felt an unfamiliar sensation, the feeling of being truly seen rather than simply opposed. Mrs. Santos broke a parking regulation, yes, but she also saved her daughter's life by getting medication during an asthma attack, the judge said, his voice rising slightly with controlled passion. Your approach would punish her poverty as if it were a moral failing, while my approach recognizes her as a human being worthy of dignity. Stone's legal training screamed that this was exactly the emotional manipulation he'd warned against, but something in the judge's words resonated with a part of him he'd long buried. Consistency without compassion isn't justice, Mr. Stone. It's bureaucracy wearing a black robe. The judge's words hit their target with surgical precision, exposing the hollow core of Stone's legal philosophy. Maria Santos watched the exchange with growing hope, sensing that someone was finally fighting for her humanity rather than just her case. Stone felt his carefully constructed arguments crumbling under the weight of this simple, profound truth. You want to know what real precedent looks like? Judge Caprio asked, his voice now carrying the full authority of his office and experience. It's treating every person who comes before this bench as someone's son or daughter, mother or father, worthy of the same respect you'd want for your own family. Stone's breath caught in his throat as the judge's words found their mark, piercing through decades of emotional armor with devastating accuracy. That's not weakness, Mr. Stone. That's the strength that holds our communities together when everything else falls apart. The judge paused, letting his words settle into the stunned silence of the courtroom like seeds in fertile ground. Stone realized that he wasn't facing a naive small-town judge, but a master of jurisprudence who had never lost sight of justice's true purpose. The lawyer's expensive pen slipped from his trembling fingers, clattering to the floor like his falling certainty about everything he thought he knew about the law. Judge Caprio reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a worn manila folder, its edges softened by years of handling and countless reopenings. Mr. Stone, before we proceed further, I'd like to share something that might interest you, the judge said, his voice carrying a mysterious weight. Stone's arrogance flickered momentarily as curiosity overtook his professional composure, wondering what card the judge was about to play. The folder opened with a soft whisper, revealing faded newspaper clippings and old legal documents that seemed to bridge decades of forgotten history. Do you remember a case from 1998 involving Stonkowski Family Market versus Riverside Development Corporation? Judge Caprio asked quietly. Stone's face went ashen, his expensive composure cracking like ice under sudden pressure as recognition dawned in his eyes. The name Stonkowski hung in the air like a ghost from his carefully buried past. I was the defense attorney who tried to help your parents keep their store, Judge Caprio continued, his voice gentle but unwavering. The revelation hit Stone like a physical blow, his knees nearly buckling as the courtroom seemed to spin around him. Judge Caprio had been the young lawyer who'd worked pro bono, fighting against the corporate machine that eventually crushed the Stonkowski family's dreams. "I remember your mother, Anna, crying in my office when we lost the appeal," the judge said, his eyes soft with the weight of that old failure. Stone's breath came in shallow gasps as memories he'd spent decades suppressing flooded back with overwhelming force. His father's calloused hands signing the foreclosure papers, his mother's broken English as she thanked their lawyer for trying, the family's proud immigrant dignity crumbling under corporate indifference. The expensive briefcase slipped from Stone's nerveless fingers, hitting the floor with a sound like his world collapsing. "Your parents were good people, Alex," Judge Caprio said, using the name Stone hadn't heard in 20 years. The simple use of his childhood name stripped away every layer of professional armor he'd built, leaving him exposed and vulnerable in ways he'd forgotten were possible. "They taught me something important about the difference between legal victory and moral failure," the judge continued, his words penetrating Stone's shock like arrows finding their mark. Stone's eyes filled with tears he hadn't shed since his mother's funeral, the grief and guilt of decades finally breaking through his emotional barriers. The courtroom watched in stunned silence as the arrogant lawyer transformed before their eyes into the broken little boy who'd lost everything to the very system he'd later mastered. Judge Caprio's voice remained steady and compassionate, offering understanding rather than judgment to the man who'd just challenged everything he stood for. "I became a judge partly because I couldn't save your family's store," Judge Caprio revealed, his honesty cutting through Stone's defenses like a surgeon's blade. "Every case I hear, every person who stands where Mrs. Santos stands now, I remember your parents and try to do better." Stone's knees finally gave way, and he sank into his chair as the full weight of this revelation crashed over him like a tsunami. The judge, who'd shown such patience with Maria Santos, was the same man who'd fought unsuccessfully for the Stonkowski family decades earlier. Stone realized that his entire legal career had been built on running from the very compassion that Judge Caprio had never abandoned, even after failing to help Stone's parents. The lawyer's voice cracked as he whispered, You remember them?" Judge Caprio nodded solemnly, his eyes reflecting both the pain of old defeats and the hope of present redemption. In that moment, Stone understood that he wasn't facing an enemy, but the ghost of his own abandoned conscience. Stone sat in stunned silence, his expensive suit suddenly feeling like a costume worn by an imposter trying to hide from his own truth. The courtroom seemed to close in around him as decades of suppressed emotion crashed through his carefully constructed defenses like a dam bursting under unbearable pressure. "Your parents would be proud of your success, Alex," Judge Caprio said gently, "but I wonder if they'd recognize the man you've become." The words hit Stone with devastating accuracy, forcing him to confront the uncomfortable reality that his greatest professional achievements had come at the cost of his soul. Maria Santos watched the powerful lawyer crumble before her eyes, his transformation both shocking and strangely hopeful. Stone's hands shook as he stared at the floor, unable to meet anyone's gaze while wrestling with the weight of his own hypocrisy. The silence stretched on, heavy with the possibility of either redemption or complete collapse. "I became everything I hated," Stone whispered, his voice barely audible above the courtroom's ventilation system. The admission escaped his lips like a confession torn from the depths of his being, raw and unfiltered by professional calculation. Judge Caprio leaned forward slightly, his expression radiating the same compassion he'd shown Maria Santos, now extended to the man who'd challenged him so arrogantly. "You became successful, Alex, but success without conscience is just expensive emptiness," the judge replied, his words cutting through Stone's defenses with surgical precision. Stone's eyes filled with tears as he realized that every corporate victory had been built on the graves of families, just like his own. The lawyer who'd spent decades perfecting the art of emotional detachment found himself drowning in feelings he'd buried since childhood. His voice cracked as he continued, "I've spent 20 years becoming the enemy that destroyed my family. But you're here now," Judge Caprio said, his tone carrying the weight of infinite possibility and hope. "Standing in this courtroom, seeing Mrs. Santos struggle with the same challenges your mother faced, you have a choice to make." Stone looked up at Maria Santos, seeing not a case to be won or lost, but a human being deserving of the same dignity his parents had been denied. The parallel was undeniable. Her calloused hands matched his father's, her worried eyes reflected his mother's desperation, her quiet pride echoed his family's immigrant strength. Stone's professional instincts screamed that this was manipulation, but his awakening conscience recognized it as truth in its purest form. For the first time in decades, Alexander Stone found himself caring more about justice than victory, more about humanity than billable hours. The realization terrified and liberated him simultaneously, like a prisoner discovering that his cell had been unlocked all along. "What kind of lawyer do you want to be?" Judge Caprio asked, his question hanging in the air like a challenge to Stone's very identity. The words echoed through Stone's mind, reverberating against memories of his idealistic younger self, who'd once dreamed of using law to protect people like his parents. Stone's expensive watch ticked away seconds that felt like hours as he grappled with the most important decision of his professional life. I don't know anymore," he admitted, his voice breaking with the weight of uncertainty and possibility. The admission was both defeat and victory, the death of Alexander Stone, the corporate warrior, and the potential rebirth of Alex Stonkowski, the advocate for justice. Judge Caprio smiled slightly, recognizing the moment when a hardened heart begins to remember how to feel. Maria Santos watched with growing hope as the man who'd seemed so cold and calculating wrestled with his own humanity in front of everyone. Stone slowly rose from his chair, his movements deliberate and transformed, as if he were shedding an old skin in front of the entire courtroom. "Mrs. Santos," he said, his voice carrying none of its earlier arrogance, replaced instead by genuine humility and respect. The woman looked up at him with surprise, expecting another legal assault, but finding something entirely different in his changed demeanor. "I owe you an apology," Stone continued, his words carefully chosen and delivered with authentic remorse rather than calculated strategy. Judge Caprio watched silently as the transformation unfolded, recognizing the rare moment when a human soul remembers its true purpose. Stone's expensive briefcase remained closed on the floor, abandoned like his former approach to justice, its contents suddenly irrelevant to what truly mattered. The courtroom held its collective breath, sensing that they were witnessing something far more significant than a simple traffic violation hearing. "Your Honor," Stone said, turning to face Judge Caprio with newfound respect shining in his eyes like dawn breaking after a long, dark night. "I withdraw all objections to your handling of this case and formally request permission to change my recommendation." The words came out steadily despite the emotional earthquake occurring within him, each syllable representing another step away from his old self. Judge Caprio nodded encouragingly, his wise eyes reflecting both surprise and deep satisfaction at this unexpected turn of events. Stone's voice grew stronger as he continued, "Mrs. Santos deserves the same compassion and understanding that my own mother needed but never received." The parallel was no longer painful but purposeful, connecting his family's past struggle to this woman's present need for justice. Maria Santos pressed her hand to her heart, overwhelmed by this powerful man's sudden advocacy for her situation. The courtroom atmosphere shifted from tension to hope as Stone's transformation became complete and undeniable. Furthermore, Stone continued, his legal training now serving justice rather than corporate interests, I believe this case demonstrates exactly why your approach to jurisprudence is not just valid, but essential." The words flowed from him like water from a broken dam. 20 years of suppressed conscience finally finding its voice. He turned to address Maria Santos directly, his tone gentle and respectful. "You remind me of my mother, who worked 3 jobs and still couldn't afford proper legal representation." Judge Caprio smiled slightly, recognizing that the angry young man who'd lost his parents' store had finally found his way home to his true calling. Stone's transformation was complete, from Alexander the corporate warrior to Alex the advocate for those who needed a voice. The expensive suit remained the same, but the man wearing it had been fundamentally changed by confronting his own buried humanity. Maria Santos began to cry, not from fear this time, but from relief and gratitude at finally being seen as a person rather than just another case number. "Your Honor, I respectfully request that you handle Mrs. Santos's case with the same wisdom and compassion you've shown throughout this hearing," Stone concluded, his voice carrying the strength of newfound purpose. The man who'd entered the courtroom seeking to demolish Judge Caprio's methods now stood as their most powerful advocate. Stone's hands no longer shook with anger or arrogance, but with the trembling excitement of someone discovering their true calling after decades of wandering in the wilderness. Judge Caprio's eyes sparkled with the satisfaction of a teacher watching a difficult student finally understand the lesson. The courtroom erupted in quiet murmurs of amazement as spectators processed what they'd just witnessed, the complete moral transformation of a man who'd seemed irredeemably lost to cynicism. Stone looked at his reflection in the courtroom's window and saw not Alexander the destroyer, but Alex the protector, finally worthy of his parents' sacrifice and Judge Caprio's early faith. The moment marked not just the resolution of a traffic case, but the redemption of a human soul. 6 months after that transformative day in Judge Caprio's courtroom, Alexander Stone had quietly dissolved his corporate practice and opened a modest storefront law office in Federal Hill. The brass nameplate now read Stonkowski and Associates, Community Legal Services, honoring both his heritage and his newfound mission to serve those who couldn't afford traditional representation. His first client had been Maria Santos, whom he'd helped navigate immigration paperwork for her eldest son's college applications, working pro bono with the same dedication he'd once reserved for million-dollar corporate deals. The expensive suits remained, but they now served a different purpose, lending credibility and respect to clients who deserved both, but rarely received either. Judge Caprio had attended the office opening, quietly proud of the transformation he'd witnessed and the ripple effects it was creating throughout the community. Stone's former colleagues whispered about his nervous breakdown, unable to comprehend that he'd actually experienced a breakthrough into authentic purpose and meaning. The irony wasn't lost on him that losing his corporate identity had helped him find his true self. The impact extended far beyond Stone's personal transformation, creating waves that touched countless lives throughout Providence and beyond. Maria Santos had become something of a community advocate herself, sharing her story at local meetings and encouraging other struggling families to seek the legal help they deserved. Judge Caprio's approach gained new validation as other legal professionals witnessed the power of compassion-centered justice through Stone's dramatic conversion. The courthouse staff noticed a subtle shift in atmosphere. Other lawyers began treating defendants with more respect, inspired by the example of transformation they'd witnessed firsthand. Stone's story spread through social media and legal journals, sparking conversations about the purpose of law and the responsibility of those who practice it. Local law schools began inviting both Judge Caprio and Stone to speak about the intersection of legal expertise and human compassion. The courtroom where everything changed became a symbol of hope for those who believed the justice system could still serve humanity rather than just procedure. Stone's law practice thrived not through corporate connections, but through word-of-mouth referrals from grateful clients who'd never expected to be treated with such dignity and respect. He hired 3 other attorneys who shared his commitment to community service, creating a small firm that measured success in lives improved rather than profits maximized. The man who'd once intimidated opponents through legal technicalities now used those same skills to protect vulnerable families from predatory landlords, wage theft, and bureaucratic indifference. Every case reminded him of his parents' struggles and Judge Caprio's patient wisdom, grounding his practice in the human reality behind legal abstractions. Stone's transformation had inspired several other high-powered attorneys to reconsider their own priorities, leading to a small but significant shift in the legal community's approach to justice. His story became a powerful reminder that it's never too late to choose compassion over cynicism, service over self-interest. The expensive briefcase that had once carried weapons of legal warfare now held tools of advocacy and hope. 3 years later, Stone stood before the same courthouse where his life had changed, now as a guest speaker at the annual Legal Aid Society fundraiser. Judge Caprio sat in the front row, his eyes twinkling with the satisfaction of a mentor watching his student surpass even his highest expectations. Justice without compassion is just expensive cruelty, Stone told the gathered crowd, his words carrying the authority of someone who'd lived on both sides of that divide. The audience included Maria Santos, now a paralegal in Stone's office, her children thriving thanks to the stability his advocacy had helped provide. Stone's parents would have been proud to see their son using his gifts to lift up families like their own, rather than serving the corporate interests that had once destroyed their dreams. The transformation that began with a simple traffic violation had become a testament to the power of authentic justice and human redemption. As applause filled the room, Stone caught Judge Caprio's eye and nodded gratefully, both men understanding that sometimes the most important victories happen not in courtrooms, but in human hearts. This incredible transformation shows that even the hardest hearts can be softened by genuine compassion and wisdom. Judge Caprio's patient justice didn't just change one lawyer's life, it created ripples of hope throughout an entire community. What do you think about this powerful story of redemption? Subscribe for more inspiring tales of justice and humanity, and share your thoughts in the comments below.